Hi, and welcome to the Beyond the Box podcast. I'm Tamara Renée. I'm the owner of Insight EQ Solutions, where strategy meets human insight. My research focuses on the relationship between emotional intelligence and resilience. So, with that being said, welcome to season 2, episode 1 of the Beyond the Box podcast, where I come to test our assumptions about the way the world works. I come to ask big questions about the way that we think about ourselves, others, in the world. And the purpose of the Beyond the Box framework, if you will, is to start deconstructing the way that we have been taught to think the world works, right? So we've all been taught to think that humans are a certain way and society has to run a certain way. We've inherited beliefs around religion, around men and women, around all kinds of things. And these big assumptions drive our decisions and have major influence over everything that we do. Sometimes we cling to these assumptions or these beliefs at the expense of our own and others' well-being. And so my goal isn't to champion any specific ideology or belief system. It's more about unpacking the belief systems that we hold collectively and individually and kind of look at what are the consequences of those belief systems, and do those belief systems still serve us? So when we think about thinking beyond the box, it's not just trying to think outside of the box, but it's asking ourselves, do we need a box altogether? What would life look like without these boxes, without these very rigid ways of thinking about ourselves, thinking about other people, and the assumptions that we have about the way the world works? And we have these assumptions about the way the world works as if we are not contributing to the way the world works through our own thinking, through our own mental models. This is where my expertise as an organizational development consultant comes in, because my expertise lies in asking good questions. It lies in being curious. It lies in facilitating conflict, right? How do I help people work through and hold the tension rather than rush to resolve or collapse that tension too quickly? Because tension is where all of our change and creativity live. We can't change. We don't make progress as a species without that tension, without that agitation. So I like to hold complexity. I don't rush to resolve it. And sometimes I name these nuances and these complexities out loud at the expense of being called all kinds of names. And I'm learning to acknowledge that people reach for name calling when they're too overwhelmed by the complexity of the argument, and so they resort to personal attacks. What I've learned is that people are not attacking you. They are staunchly defending their belief system, and I want you to really think about that. Think about how frightened people are. Think about how afraid you have to be to lash out in that way, how fearful we are when it comes to our belief systems. Like, we cling to them so rigidly as if we would die without them, as if we would collapse, as if the whole world would fall apart if we didn't have these belief systems. So that's how tightly we all have the capacity to cling to these beliefs, whatever they may be. And without that capacity to test our assumptions and to bear the discomfort of those difficult emotions, we have to be able to withstand that fear if we're to move beyond our ways of thinking. And I'm clear that everyone is not ready to do that. I'm clear that we have been taught to become so identified with our beliefs that changing and updating our beliefs means death, is akin to some kind of death of the self, a death of the identity. With all of that being said, I wanted to talk about one of the major points of contention in our society is capitalism. And at the expense of being called a libtard or a communist, I was called a child abuser because I was talking about the impact of capitalism on our ability to cultivate community. I was just like, wow. So at the expense of being attacked, where, now I know, like, okay, you're not really attacking me. You're just trying to defend your very fragile belief system. And the only way you know how to do that is to, call me names and stuff, right? But in any case, at the risk of being called all kinds of names, I wanted to talk about capitalism because, again, my role as someone who is so passionate about like collective resilience, collective transformation, collective change, I'm looking at the world around me. And if you're attuned to the way that people are being impacted by our political beliefs and our socioeconomic beliefs, if you just look around, you'll see that there is a real human cost to the way that we continue to move about in the world as if this is just the way the world works. I think very few of us are willing to confront those assumptions. I want to use capitalism as a topic of discussion to kind of highlight the way that binary thinking, black and white thinking, prevents us from collaborating with each other, prevents us from co-creating solutions to some of our biggest challenges. One of the things that we've been taught to assume is just a part of life is we live with the trade-offs of certain beliefs. For example, if we talk about how overconsumption, individual consumption, how that impacts the environment, people are willing to overlook that and say it's just the price of playing the game. And in our personal lives, in our relationships, in our workplaces, there are so many trade-offs that we accept as it's just the way the world works. And unfortunately for me, have never been comfortable with the way that the world works, with just accepting like, oh, these trade-offs just exist and there's nothing we can do about it. Because I think that undermines human potential. I think that undermines our creative potential. I think that undermines our ingenuity as a species. So without further ado, let's look at capitalism. Now, I posted something on social media I think it was yesterday, talking about how capitalism needs to maximize profits by focusing on the individual. And this is simple math. This is not a leap. I make more money if I sell to 10 individuals than 3, right? And so one of the things that keeps capitalism going is with respect to our capacity to maximize profit, we need to sell to as many people as possible, which means we need to create the largest total addressable market possible. Of course, the more individuals in that market, the more potential we have to maximize profits within that market. What I'm noticing, because I'm attuned to the way we think about things influences what we experience, is that because there's this emphasis on individual consumerism, because it's a primary driver of capitalism, people are struggling to cultivate community. I'm seeing the impact of that on our relationships. I'm seeing the impact of that on our capacity for genuine connection. We enter relationships not as co-creators, but as consumers. And so I was just really talking about like what possibilities are available to us if we banded together within our communities and began pooling resources and sharing resources. Suddenly, this became a conversation about communism. I'm very clear about what communism is and why it doesn't work. I'm not a communist. And there's a huge difference between individual members of a community coming together to support one another, to help reduce waste and minimize debt. There's a difference between that and a centralized government that is controlling the value of resources and the distribution of resources. I want to challenge people to really think about how this shows up in their own lives. When you feel threatened by an opposing opinion, what's happening for you is that there are unacknowledged assumptions. There are questions that you have about it. You don't want to subject the premise to questioning because your house is not built on solid ground. You've built your house on sand. This is the only reason why anyone gets defensive. I acknowledge this in my own life. When I get defensive, I realize, ooh, something about the underlying premise here is, I'm not strong in my own argument. I don't feel really grounded in my position. That's the only reason why the claws are coming out and I'm wanting to, to fight. This is what happens time and again, and why people, instead of really grappling with the complexity of capitalism for all of its benefits and harms, if you bring up the harms or you bring up the relational impact or the psychological impact, you're a communist. I've been calling that argument lazy. And it is, but I also want to bring my compassion to this and understanding that it's more than just being intellectually lazy. It's also being afraid. It's also realizing the fragility of your own stance. So why is it that people have such a difficult time just acknowledging that, hey, capitalism isn't the best? You know what I mean? Like, hey, maybe we can do better. I've read different books from free market capitalist thinkers, and they were very inspiring. I think that capitalism as an economic system has enormous potential. I do. I do not want to live in a society where there's a lack of competition or creativity among business owners. I don't want to live in a society where there's a cap on your potential in any way. I don't want to live in a society that limits freedom. I don't want to live in a society that tries to erase my individuality. So there are things about capitalism that I respect that I think make a lot of sense. And with that said, I'm also aware of the extent to which this emphasis on profit maximization and, the commodification of everything, how this is creating challenges for us as a species. And if we're not willing to sit with both of those things, with both the potential benefits and the real harms, the real cost, the real impact, I think that we're being intellectually dishonest and we're being emotionally dishonest. We need to be able to name the challenges. We need to be able to hold the complexity of our ideas and to sit with the fact that, hey, this isn't perfect. And instead of, saying, well, that's just the way it is. That's just these are the trade-offs we make. We need to go a step further. I think we owe it to ourselves as a species to go further, go a step further and not settle for the trade-offs. Don't settle for them. Why are we settling for anything? We have enormous creative potential as a species. Why are we settling for anything at all? Why? We don't have to. We don't have to settle for children in the United States going hungry. We don't have to settle for things like that. We don't have to settle for people not receiving medical treatment. We don't have to settle for these things going, well, that's just the way it is. That is, we owe it to ourselves to go further than we think we can as a species. And as much as we push ourselves with technological development, we have become so complacent with our own development as a species. This frustrates me so deeply. We're like, oh, can AI develop consciousness one day? How about addressing gaps in our own consciousness? How about addressing some of our own dysfunctional ways of thinking? How about exploring human potential? Technological development is not going to compensate for a lack of human development. We need to continue to emphasize human development. And I know all the OD nerds out there are going to agree with me because that's why you get into OD. You're an OD practitioner because you believe in human potential and you want to see that potential actualized in a group, in an organization, in a church, in a community. That's why you get into OD. Anyway, I've been sitting with this and I'm like, okay, what are some of the major assumptions that hold capitalism together? What are the drivers of capitalism? And the first is this assumption about human nature, that humans are inherently lazy and selfish. Maybe the laziness and the selfishness are not character flaws necessarily, but they are symptoms of our desire to conserve resources and also to maximize gains while minimizing losses. And so there's some truth to that. The body does aim to conserve resources. We also are predisposed to seeking out pleasure while avoiding pain or minimizing the amount of pain that we experience. And loss can register as a type of pain. So that's one big assumption. This big assumption about human nature. Humans are trying to get the most while giving the least. The second big assumption that keeps capitalism going is this idea that resources are scarce. There's a finite amount of land, there's a finite amount of water, there's a finite amount of vegetation. Resources are scarce and finite. The third assumption is this emphasis on free choice and individuality. Value is subjective, and so I want my choices about what I find valuable to be reflected in the market, which makes sense, right? I don't want someone to dictate to me what is valuable and what that value is. Value is subjective, it's relative. And in order for us to capture the relative value of goods and services, then we need to acknowledge the role of the individual. Perfect. Got it. Makes sense, right? Makes sense. The fourth big assumption is that capitalism fosters the competition that drives innovation. I can get with that. As relative value changes, companies are forced to adapt and compete through innovation. And if one company has a monopoly on a specific product or service, they may become complacent. They're not going to be incentivized to innovate unless we introduce competition into the market. And how do we have this competition? It's because of individual choice, individual preference, and subjective value. Demands are always shifting. Okay, makes sense to me. The fifth big assumption, the last and the fifth, is the only alternative to capitalism is communism. Well, if we do not have capitalism, we are sacrificing our free choice. We are saying we don't care about our individuality. Getting rid of capitalism means, succumbing to a loss of my personal choice, my personal preferences, my individuality, my right to choose. And that means we're going to be living in a society where there's centralized governance over these things. And I don't want that. Okay, great. So let's just hold those assumptions for a second. And we won't hold them as true or false, but as data. Okay, these assumptions are data. I'm not here to dismantle those assumptions because they're meaningful. They are based on observation. They are based on data. that have been gathered by many people, many intelligent people. And I think it's important to hold those assumptions as valuable. Now, here's the part where I think there's room to begin questioning these assumptions, and not whether or not they're true or false, but do they hold under every condition? Are these assumptions absolute truths, or are they just assumptions? So let's look at the first one. Human nature is inherently selfish and lazy because we are wired to conserve resources and to minimize losses while maximizing gains. Is that true? Does that hold always? Are humans inherently selfish? I know you're probably thinking about your boss. You're probably thinking about an ex of yours. You're probably, you might be thinking about yourself, and you might be going, yeah, we are. And yet tons of research and social science show us that humans are not inherently selfish. When we look at different studies looking at human nature, we see time and time again that on the whole, humans are actually not inherently selfish. People don't always behave in a way that means they're conserving resources. These economic models don't always hold. There are lots of counterexamples of how human beings are actually willing to do good even when it doesn't benefit them. So this idea that we're always trying to maximize gains while minimizing losses, and that we're inherently lazy and selfish, I think that assumption is true at times, and then there are times when it isn't true. Human motivation is a very complex subject, and I could spend many different episodes exploring different facets of human motivation. And this overly simplified model of human behavior, it doesn't hold. The other interesting thing about this assumption is that it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we assume that humans are selfish, we end up maybe engineering more of it. So that's something to sit with. The second assumption is this idea that resources are scarce. Is that true? Is scarcity the foundational principle that governs all human interaction? Or have we manufactured scarcity? Looking at forager societies and indigenous societies, we saw people living in community with each other and with the environment in such a way that they were able to live sustainably through principles of abundance and sufficiency. This idea that scarcity is the basis of all human behavior, I have this sense that this is a manufactured belief system. It's one of the things that drives the individualism, the hyper-individualism that keeps capitalism going. Because if we weren't operating on principles of scarcity, but instead operated on principles of sufficiency and abundance, then people wouldn't be buying up all of the toilet paper during a pandemic. They would buy the amount of toilet paper that they needed for themselves and their household, while trusting that more would be on the way and leaving enough for others. The collateral impact of deciding that scarcity is fundamental fuels the assumption that humans are selfish. But to what extent are we manufacturing that? Through the stories that we're telling about the environment that we're living in. When you're operating from principles of extraction and exploitation, when you see the land as something that you use rather than as something that you are in communion with, then yes, it becomes scarce. What would happen? How would our relationship to these resources change if we stopped bringing this extraction, exploitation perspective to everything that we interact with? If we weren't interacting with people and our environment from the perspective of, what can I gain from this? What can I get from this interaction? What can I gain from the land? This is where our co-creative capacity is being suffocated. And it's at the heart of consumerism, this principle of extraction. And what am I getting out of this? And I want to pay as little as possible for this, because we're keeping these principles or these assumptions with respect to human laziness and selfishness and resource scarcity. We're keeping these things alive. Anyone who is trained in marketing or social psychology knows exactly what I'm talking about. The third assumption that I want us to sit with is this idea that capitalism allows for free choice. Individuality is necessary for allowing market demand to evolve in a way that is respectful of people's choices, right? But there's a difference between being independent and being interdependent. Sometimes we overemphasize individuality without bearing in mind that our decisions impact others in ways that we see and don't see. We're not existing in a vacuum where our decisions only impact us. They impact everyone around us, whether we can see it or not. We are so quick to bypass the consequences of this hyper individualistic mindset so that we can sleep peacefully at night. The fourth assumption that I think is important for us to sit with is this idea that competition is necessary to foster innovation. Is it true that we need competition to foster innovation? Is there also room for collaboration to foster innovation? There are examples of companies collaborating on solutions to bring life-changing products and services to the people. I'm not against competition, and I think competition is healthy. I think collaboration is also valuable and might even outperform competition. There are several social science studies that show that collaboration tends to outperform competition with respect to the quality of solutions that are reached. So it's something to sit with. Is this always true? Is competition the only way to foster innovation? And the last assumption that I think is worth challenging or sitting with, questioning, testing, it feels so self-explanatory, and yet it isn't. It's this idea that the only alternative to capitalism is communism. If that's really what you believe, that the only alternative to capitalism is communism, that says a lot about what you think about our potential as a species and our capacity to create something that exceeds both. As I said before, there are real human costs to this profit maximization model. We need to maximize profits at the expense of people. We need to emphasize the role of the individual consumer at the expense of their relationships and their capacity to create community. And as a matter of fact, I said this in that video that I made. I said capitalism is antagonistic to community. Because again, it makes more sense to sell to 10 individuals than to sell to one group. That is driving a lot of the waste that we are generating right now. I don't know. I want to leave this here, and I'm sorry for the abrupt ending. But, I'm using capitalism as an example of how we get stuck in rigid binary thinking that something is either all right or all wrong without really holding the complexity and sitting with that tension and allowing that tension to inspire us to something greater, something more viable, something more sustainable. We get very locked into rigid ways of being and thinking, and we limit our own potential, our own capacity to improve and to iterate on the things that we create. And we hold on to things after they've outlived their usefulness. We're just clinging to things that no longer work because we are unsure, uncertain of what will replace capitalism. And so we're referencing the past and we're going, well, the only other thing that we were going to replace capitalism with was communism. The other thing, when I challenge capitalism, or speak out against the harms of capitalism, people think that I'm advocating for a moneyless society. I see the value in money. A dollar is a standardized unit of value that allows us to exchange goods and services. I'm not against money. I think there is something perverse about hoarding money, but that's another topic for another day, I suppose. I hope that this gave you food for thought, and I hope that you bring this to other challenging topics, especially those of a social nature, because we are losing our capacity for complexity, for nuance. We are becoming increasingly rigid in the way that we think about ourselves, others, and the world. We are clinging to beliefs with an unbelievable degree of rigidity. We're increasingly fearful of others' ideas. We're becoming more and more identified with our ideas. Our ideas have us. We don't have ideas. But this is part of the reason that Beyond the Box exists as a space for exploring some of these things. And I welcome constructive dissent. I welcome you pointing out my own assumptions and helping me to explore and unpack mine, but in good faith. Let's learn how to navigate conflict without unnecessary aggression, without the need to attack others. I think let's strive for that.